Caitlyn Clark just watched the absolute biggest and most heavily publicized rival of her entire professional career get unceremoniously shipped out of town for absolutely nothing in return. And those of you who are sitting at home right now, furiously typing on your keyboards and calling Angel Reese a tragic victim of some massive front office injustice, are completely and utterly missing the real point of this entire unprecedented situation. People all over the internet and across every major social media platform are screaming at the top of their lungs that the Chicago Sky organization was overly ruthless for abandoning their supposed franchise cornerstone. They are crying foul and claiming that the front office betrayed a player who was supposed to be the foundational building block of their entire future championship window. But today, I am going to completely pull back the heavy curtain and show you the real unvarnished numbers and the deeply hidden truth behind this earth-shattering and historic trade. This was absolutely not your standard everyday professional basketball player swap, where two teams just decide to mutually part ways for the sake of salary cap flexibility. This was the explosive and inevitable result of an unfixable psychological fracture behind closed doors that had been violently brewing for many long and agonizing months. It is finally time we have a brutally honest and completely unfiltered conversation about the real verifiable reason Chicago management accepted literal pennies on the dollar just to get rid of their highly touted all-star forward. If you stick around with me until the very final seconds of this incredibly revealing video, you are going to discover exactly why the mainstream sports media complex is working massive amounts of overtime. They are desperately trying to build a protective and completely impenetrable shield of half-truths and carefully crafted excuses around Angel Reese and her falling stock. We are going to completely decode and ruthlessly expose the infamous and deeply embarrassing statistical phenomenon that basketball insiders have quietly labeled the mebound. This is the exact same hidden and destructive metric that has been silently and methodically destroying the offensive flow of any single basketball team unfortunate enough to try and build a system around her. And most importantly, you are going to finally and clearly understand why this monumental organizational collapse serves as the ultimate, undeniable proof of Caitlyn Clark and her absolute dominance over the women's professional basketball landscape. This is no longer just a simple conversation about bouncing a leather ball on a hardwood floor or running basic pick-and-roll sets during a Tuesday night regular season game. This is a deep, dark, and incredibly dramatic story about vicious power struggles and toxic locker room politics and the true fundamental meaning of professional sportsmanship at the highest possible level. Before we dive deep into these shocking and controversial details, I need to make one specific thing perfectly and absolutely clear to every single person watching this right now. Every single piece of information, every stat, and every narrative presented in this video is built on thoroughly verified inside reports and incredibly deep, uncompromising data analysis. Our channel operates completely independently from any corporate influence, and we absolutely do not represent any individual player, any specific sports agency, or any front office organization operating within the league. We have total and unwavering respect for all of the incredible athletes who have the courage to step onto that professional floor and put their bodies on the line night after night. But we are strictly and unapologetically focused on peeling back the deceptive layers of public relations spin and letting the raw, unedited, and undeniable numbers do the heavy talking. The Chicago Sky front office management deliberately and intentionally used the highly specific and legally loaded phrase, conduct detrimental to the team, to publicly explain their shocking decision to suspend Angel Reese. You need to genuinely understand that this is absolutely not normal, everyday basketball terminology that you would ever hear casually thrown around in a standard post-game press conference. That is the cold, calculated, and incredibly sharp language of a ruthless corporate legal team meticulously building an undeniable bulletproof case for immediate termination of a massive contract. When a professional sports franchise publicly uses those exact damning words, they are intentionally and systematically creating a permanent paper trail to justify legally separating themselves from what they view as a highly toxic asset. The fragile foundation of this supposedly unbreakable player and team relationship actually began to violently crumble all the way back in September during a completely disastrous stretch of the season. That was the exact moment when Reese made the incredibly arrogant and destructive decision to publicly humiliate her own hardworking teammates right in front of the flashing cameras of the national media. Just try for 1 single second to put yourself in the exhausted shoes of the other hardworking women sitting inside that incredibly tense and suffocating locker room environment. Imagine opening up your phone after a grueling, bone-crushing 3-hour practice, only to read viral quotes from your supposed star franchise player, heavily implying that you are simply not talented enough to even share the basketball court with her. The unbelievable and staggering audacity of that specific selfish moment sent massive, unavoidable shockwaves through the very core of the entire Chicago practice facility and front office headquarters. Respected veterans who had been tirelessly grinding and bleeding in this highly competitive league for many years were suddenly and callously being thrown right under the proverbial bus. And they were being thrown under that bus by a loud, brash rookie who had not even proven she could consistently lead a professional team to a respectable winning record without completely melting down. But the shocking way Reese reacted to the massive public fallout from those comments was somehow even more damaging to her professional reputation than the initial catastrophic interview itself. She immediately and suspiciously claimed she was dealing with a very serious, undisclosed physical injury in what looked like a blatant attempt to simply avoid facing the heavy music. She completely refused to step up to the podium, look the reporters in the eye, and take any shred of personal accountability for the absolute mess she had just intentionally created. Yet, mere hours after making that dramatic claim about her supposed debilitating injury, a highly controversial cell phone video miraculously surfaced and spread like absolute wildfire across the internet. That damning video clearly showed her dancing, jumping, and partying aggressively on a luxurious private jet without a single visible care in the world or any sign of physical limitation whatsoever. That was the exact, undeniable breaking point when the frustrated coaching staff and the exasperated front office executives realized they had a massive, unfixable maturity problem permanently residing on their hands. You simply cannot stand there and demand the immense respect and the massive financial compensation of a true franchise player while simultaneously acting like an irresponsible teenager on a wild weekend getaway. The second things get slightly difficult. But believe it or not, the incredibly toxic and suffocating environment she created inside the locker room was not even the biggest, most glaring red flag for the Chicago front office evaluators. Let us finally sit down and talk about the giant, unavoidable elephant in the room that her diehard, unapologetic superfans absolutely refuse to acknowledge under any circumstances whatsoever. They have affectionately and mockingly started calling her highly inflated rebounding statistics by a deeply sarcastic and incredibly accurate nickname known across the internet as the mebound. When you actually sit down, turn off the biased commentary, and painfully grind through the raw, unedited game tape, a horrifying and undeniable offensive pattern suddenly emerges. This specific repetitive pattern completely and totally discredits the historical validity of the massive rebounding numbers she was supposedly putting up on a nightly basis. A mathematically absurd and frankly embarrassing percentage of her highly praised and heavily publicized offensive rebounds actually come directly from her entirely missing her own wildly uncontrolled point-blank layups. She will recklessly force her way into the painted area and throw up a wild, heavily contested, and poorly angled shot that inevitably clanks violently off the side of the iron rim, and then using her undeniable athletic length, she immediately rips the basketball right away from the outstretched hands of her own teammates just to violently throw up yet another terrible, unbalanced shot attempt. This incredibly selfish, stat-padding style of isolation play completely and systematically destroys any possible chance of establishing a fluid, efficient, and modern offensive floor spacing dynamic. Instead of intelligently kicking the ball out and opening up the court for her highly skilled perimeter guards to properly operate, she essentially clogs the entire painted area with her chaotic movements. She single-handedly creates an absolute nightmare of a traffic jam right underneath the basket, making it mathematically impossible for any of her teammates to find a clean driving lane to the hoop. When the desperate Chicago coaching staff attempted to salvage the situation by pairing her in the front court with the incredibly talented and towering Camila Cardoso, the on-court results were historically and undeniably catastrophic. That specific, highly anticipated front-court duo ultimately combined to produce the absolute worst and most embarrassing defensive rating in the entire professional basketball league during the highly competitive 2025 regular season. The smartest opposing point guards and head coaches across the country would essentially draw up plays to relentlessly target them every single time they brought the ball down the hardwood floor. They would completely expose their absolute fundamental lack of defensive synergy communication and lateral quickness in the high pick-and-roll situations time and time again. Opposing perimeter guards would easily and routinely blow right past the initial point of defense and find absolutely zero legitimate rim protection waiting for them in the painted area. The Chicago front office was eventually and forcefully backed into a dark, inescapable corner and forced to make an incredibly difficult franchise-altering choice between two very high-profile young prospects. And they ultimately, and very wisely, chose to keep Cardoso on the roster, because she is a younger, taller, and much more fundamentally sound traditional center. Cardoso is a player who actually genuinely understands how to sacrifice her own personal statistics and play properly within the boundaries of a winning team concept. And the ultimate undeniable reason this massive, shocking trade is currently being universally labeled by sports analysts as a total and complete disaster for Chicago is precisely because it brutally exposed her true plummeting market value. When a professional basketball franchise makes the agonizing decision to trade away a supposed all-star talent, they usually demand and receive a massive game-changing haul of future first-round draft picks. They usually expect to bring back a war chest of promising young talent and flexible salary cap space to instantly accelerate their upcoming organizational rebuild. But the completely desperate Chicago Sky essentially had to attach their own valuable future assets just to convince another opposing general manager to take on her massive, unchecked ego. They literally had to pay another professional basketball team to absorb her completely disruptive locker room presence and take her incredibly heavy emotional baggage off of their tired hands. While all of this exhausting, unprecedented, and highly publicized internal drama was systematically tearing the Chicago franchise apart from the inside out, something incredible was happening just a few states away. Caitlyn Clark was completely isolated from the petty noise, putting her head down and busy completely revolutionizing the entire global game of women's professional basketball on a nightly basis. Clark aggressively focused strictly on elevating the entire profile of the league with her mind-bending logo, three-pointers, and her absolute, undeniable genius-level court vision in transition. She was single-handedly responsible for completely selling out massive arenas across the entire country, forcing opposing professional coaches to completely tear up and rewrite their entire defensive playbooks just to try and slow her down. Meanwhile, on the exact opposite side of the spectrum, Angel Reese was being repeatedly and loudly accused by fans and analysts of intentionally weaponizing their historic college rivalry to benefit her own brand. Critics pointed out that she was constantly trying to paint herself as the tragic, misunderstood victim of some grand, overarching, and totally unfounded discriminatory conspiracy within the sports media. Instead of simply stepping onto the hardwood and letting her raw basketball game do the talking, she constantly tried to psychologically manipulate the mainstream media narrative. She desperately wanted to frame herself as a heroic underdog who was constantly being treated unfairly by the league officials, the hostile road fans, and the veteran analysts. But if you actually take the time to go back and closely review the high-definition game tape from their highly anticipated head-to-head professional matchups, the reality is shocking. The sheer level of unprovoked, highly aggressive physical intimidation she directed at Clark is honestly hard to watch without feeling completely uncomfortable and questioning the officiating. There are countless, undeniably clear clips circulating the internet showing Reese violently pulling Clark backward by the jersey and committing borderline dangerous, non-basketball flagrant fouls. These were highly aggressive, physical actions that went way beyond the accepted boundaries of hard-nosed competitive professional basketball and crossed over into malicious intent. She was clearly not attempting to make a legitimate basketball play on the ball, but rather she was trying to send a violent physical message born out of pure, unchecked frustration and deep-seated professional jealousy. Even her own seasoned veteran Chicago teammates were frequently left standing flat-footed on the court in pure, unadulterated disbelief as they watched her completely unravel emotionally on national television. They watched in absolute paralyzing horror as Reese intentionally tried to twist every single post-game media narrative into a highly toxic, combative, and deeply negative direction night after exhausting night. Instead of acting like a leader and talking about the collective team's performance, the required tactical adjustments, or the effort of her teammates, she would aggressively hijack the microphone. She would constantly and relentlessly bring the entire focus of the press conference back to herself, her personal brand, and her laundry list of perceived imaginary grievances against the world. That relentless, suffocating, and never-ending campaign of public negativity was the final, devastating match that completely burned down whatever tiny shred of mutual trust was left inside that divided Chicago locker room. You simply and fundamentally cannot win professional basketball games when your supposed emotional leader is constantly fighting imaginary, exhausting battles in the post-game press conference. You cannot build a championship culture when your star player is more concerned with winning internet arguments than she is with fighting for 50-50 loose balls on the defensive end of the court. This is the incredibly ugly, completely unvarnished, and highly uncomfortable truth that the major mainstream sports broadcasting networks consistently try their absolute hardest to aggressively sweep right under the rug. They systematically ignore these glaring behavioral issues because it completely ruins their perfectly crafted, highly profitable, and artificially balanced underdog storyline that they sell to the casual viewers. They desperately want you to blindly believe that this is a perfectly balanced, historically epic rivalry between two equally great generational basketball players destined to battle for the next decade. But the cold, hard, advanced statistical numbers and the highly fractured, completely toxic locker room chemistry tell a vastly, completely different and far more depressing story about the reality of the situation. There is a massive, incredibly profound, and universally applicable life lesson hidden right smack in the middle of this chaotic, highly publicized mess between these two famous athletes. This incredible, deeply dramatic saga teaches us absolutely everything we will ever need to know about the crushing, suffocating weight of extreme public pressure and massive external expectations. It shows us exactly how our personal, unscripted reactions to that intense pressure ultimately define our permanent professional destiny and our lasting legacy in the eyes of the public. Pressure itself, no matter how intense, does not magically forge a true resilient champion out of thin air just because they possess raw athletic talent and a massive social media following. It is exactly and precisely how you choose to carry that incredibly heavy psychological burden that truly reveals your actual undeniable worth to the world and to the people relying on you. Caitlyn Clark boldly stepped onto the highly scrutinized professional hardwood, carrying the absolute heaviest and most unrealistic expectations in the entire recorded history of modern women's sports. And despite the massive target firmly painted on her back, she gracefully and silently chose to answer every single one of her harshest, most vocal critics through her undeniable, breathtaking brilliance with the basketball in her hands. She absolutely never once complained to the media about the incredibly brutal, bruising physical defense or the immense, suffocating pressure of being the undisputed face of the league. She just simply put her head down, tuned out the overwhelming noise, and kept calmly hitting incredibly difficult step-back three-pointers while dropping jaw-dropping, highlight reel assists to her cutting teammates. On the completely and fundamentally opposite side of the entire psychological spectrum, Angel Reese clearly and consistently chose to aggressively prioritize building a glamorous, highly confrontational, and deeply controversial personal brand. She tragically allowed her own massive, unchecked personal ego and the deeply destructive internal locker room fractures to completely derail and sabotage what legitimately could have been a Hall of Fame legendary career. She consistently and undeniably focused significantly more of her precious energy on her flashy podcast appearances, her lucrative endorsement deals, and her highly curated pre-game tunnel outfits. She prioritized all of that superficial noise way above, putting in the necessary agonizing hours in the empty gym to develop a consistent, reliable mid-range jump shot, or simply learning how to set a proper fundamental pick-and-roll screen. Putting your head down and relentlessly grinding in absolute terrifying silence will always, without fail, echo infinitely louder than any manufactured dramatic argument you can possibly start on a social media platform. The absolute, undeniable, and universally accepted truth is that the final electronic scoreboard hanging in the rafters absolutely never, ever lies under any circumstances. And the cold, unforgiving post-game stat sheet absolutely never cares for a single second about exactly how many millions of blindly devoted followers you currently have on your perfectly curated and highly filtered social media accounts. Now, I want to abruptly turn the virtual floor over to every single one of you watching at home right now, because I absolutely know for a fact that you have some incredibly strong, passionate opinions about this unbelievable, unprecedented situation. If you firmly and truly believe in your heart of hearts that Caitlyn Clark is the absolute, undeniable, undisputed, and completely sustainable long-term future of this rapidly growing league, I need you to take action. I need you to drop a fiery basketball emoji down in the comment section right this exact second to officially lock in your vote and show your unwavering support for her incredible dominance. Do you honestly and genuinely think that the Atlanta Dream coaching staff possesses the required psychological brilliance to somehow magically decode the incredibly complex, highly volatile, and deeply explosive personality of Angel Reese? Or do you firmly believe deep down that they just made a massive franchise-crippling mistake and essentially traded their valuable future assets for an absolute, undeniable locker room nightmare? Do you think they just willingly imported a highly toxic, destructive element that is absolutely guaranteed to completely destroy their fragile team chemistry from the very first day of training camp? Are you actually buying into the carefully constructed mainstream media narrative that she was somehow treated incredibly unfairly and unjustly by the ruthless Chicago executives and the biased media members? Or do you clearly and logically see this entire spectacular, highly publicized, and deeply embarrassing professional downfall as the absolute natural, inevitable consequence of her own consistent lack of professionalism? Please, I am begging you to drop your most honest, completely unfiltered, and incredibly raw thoughts down below in the comment section right now. I am personally going to be staying up late reading through absolutely every single one of your passionate arguments and debating with you guys about this incredible topic all night long. So now, after all of that deep analysis, you finally know the complete, highly guarded, and totally unedited truth permanently hiding behind the absolute most controversial and shocking trade in recent modern sports history. But believe it or not, there is actually a whole different, incredibly fascinating and highly secretive story about another vastly underrated professional player who is quietly changing the entire landscape of the game. This specific player is completely revolutionizing the sport from the inside out, without ever once demanding a single ounce of the massive, blinding spotlight from the mainstream sports media. That exact, highly detailed breakdown video is magically popping up on your screen right this very moment, and trust me when I say this, you are absolutely not going to want to miss a single solitary second of it.